Hello and welcome to 5 Frames From. Today I'm talking about the 1975 film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, directed by Milos Forman and starring Jack Nicholson. Now, apart from being a really engaging film with really captivating performances, this film has gone down in history as being the second film ever to win all 5 major Academy Awards. So that includes Best Picture, Actor in a Lead Role, Actress in a Lead Role, Director and Screenplay. So this was an amazing achievement and one that has been rarely repeated in cinema history. This is even more of a huge achievement when you consider the production context of the film. Although the book was much loved and very popular, no film studios wanted to finance the film, partly because of its controversial subject matter. The rights to the book had been bought by Kirk Douglas, and Kirk Douglas had already tried to adapt the book into a play, which hadn't been very successful. So for a long time there was the desire to bring the book to the big screen, but it took more than 10 years for Michael Douglas to take over and to find the right director and get the film into production. So quite a difficult past, and because of that it's a good example of an independent film at a time when Hollywood had been largely dominated by studios. The film was funded independently by Kirk Douglas and had a budget of around $3 million, eventually taking around $109 million at the box office worldwide, so hugely successful. But like many films of this new Hollywood period, it had to keep everything very low budget, which is why our only known star in the film is Jack Nicholson at the time, and even our director hadn't yet made his mark on the film world and so therefore was fairly low cost. Now, just a bit of background on New Hollywood, which was a time where films produced between sort of 1961 and 1990 had a very different feeling, style and approach to films that came before, which had been made as part of the studio system. New Hollywood tended to feature a lot of young filmmakers who were willing to take risks. Often they would choose sort of challenging or controversial subject matter, and often it would criticise sort of authority and politics. Sometimes it would protest against those in power. There was a lot of influence from Europe, and because of that the New Hollywood directors often featured a sort of more realist approach, so would often focus on realistic characters and situations. The acting was sort of very natural, method acting was often favoured. The characters in New Hollywood are often problematic, they're kind of anti-heroes, they're often morally ambiguous, they often are involved in wrongdoing in some way. The shooting style also reflected that realism in that there was more handheld camera work, cameras were lighter and more portable at that time, but sometimes the editing and the delivery of the narrative was a bit more expressionistic in its style. So it was a very exciting time in cinema history and showed that Hollywood was going in a different direction after the studios had lost loads of money and they were in a bad way. This new way of making films was a way to draw people back to the cinemas, to produce films at a very low cost and potentially make a fair amount of profit. So let's get down to some frames, and as I've said before, I'm a big fan at looking at the beginning, middle and end of films. So my first frame comes from right at the beginning of the film, where we've got this beautiful wide shot of the scenery and we get a sense of the open space and the vastness of the American countryside. I've said that this is a beautiful landscape, but it's also quite a lonely landscape in its vastness. And again, I think that's an important theme for the film, because what is more lonely than being stuck in your own head with your own thoughts and finding it very difficult to share with others? And that's one of the positive elements of the film, is the way that McMurphy comes into the hospital and creates a sense of community with the rest of the patients. This also tells us something about how America, and quite possibly the rest of the world, dealt with those suffering from mental illnesses back in the 1960s. The vastness of the landscape and the car on the journey shows us just how far away these people are from civilised society, from normal people, and I'm using inverted commas there. And we can argue not a lot has changed, because even today we try to brush any kind of problem in society out of the way, sort of out of sight, out of mind. This shot, of course, is mirrored at the end of the film when Chief finally does get his freedom. But here in the mise-en-scène, we've got a car journeying from the left to the right-hand side of the frame. So someone going somewhere, looking to arrive somewhere. There is some enigma created, some mystery, as we don't know who is in the car. All we can see is those bright lights against this natural landscape. And the direction of the car cuts right across the screen. And so we know that whoever's in this car is going to be quite a disruptive force to this peaceful and tranquil landscape. Now, I've called this moment tranquil, but of course, the sound that we hear, the non diegetic music, is anything but tranquil. It's actually really uncomfortable on the ear, being off key and played on a saw using a bow. It's a really unusual sound. It's quite haunting, it feels uncomfortable. We might argue that it has a sort of clinical feel to it because, of course, we know that we're approaching the hospital, so maybe it reflects that. The other thing that people say about it is some of the instruments, such as the drum beat and the further drum beat at the end of the film, reflects a sort of Native American character of Chief, who arguably is our hero in this film. So the sound, really, to me, is contrapuntal to the beautiful scenery that we're seeing. You, of course, might disagree with that. There are lots of people that find this music really beautiful and therefore it's parallel to the image. Using this sort of unconventional sound was another feature of New Hollywood, which tried to avoid using traditional musical scores. This part of the film also reflects the New Hollywood preference for shooting on location, and apparently this was January when they were filming. This was Oregon, a place that gets dark at about 3:30 in the afternoon, so lots of people were critical about choosing this location and questioned why it wasn't filmed on a soundstage with a hospital specifically built as part of the set. But that commitment to realism is part of what made New Hollywood so successful, and also reflects Milos Forman's background. Growing up in Czechoslovakia and watching socialist cinema, where he noted that those films were artificial movies where nothing was true, nothing was real, everything was exaggerated. So we could argue that throughout Forman's career, he was rebelling against that artificiality. So for my second frame, I've chosen this one of Nurse Ratched, again early in the film when we're first introduced to her. And this is a good scene to contrast with McMurphy's arrival to the hospital. Here with Nurse Ratched, everything is very ordered, she looks neat and tidy. When McMurphy arrives, he's chaotic, jumping around and kissing the guards. Aside for thinking about Nurse Ratched, which we will do in a minute, I just want us to think about this in connection to the previous frame and how the interior and exterior shots are really different. They really create a different mood. Here, this is very closed in, it's very formal, it's very man-made, there's nothing natural about it, and it feels quite claustrophobic, and everything in the hospital really does. I've chosen this moment in particular because we can see Ratched through the gate. And we see lots of gates in the hospital, gates and bars, which give a sense of the hospital being more like a prison than a place where people go to get better. The gate also creates a frame within a frame, signalling to the audience just who to look at and creating a sense of power and authority for Nurse Ratched. That power is also reinforced by the sound effects, and Nurse Ratched is often accompanied by the sound of keys jangling. And this shows her authority. She's trusted enough to have the keys, she's able to come and go as she wants, and she's an active person. This contrasts with how we've seen the other patients introduced at this point. The patients are all lying in their beds, often they're chained to their beds, and they're very still and have no movement. There's clearly a hierarchy within the hospital, from the patients, the orderlies, all the way up to Nurse Ratched. She is in a similar position of power to the doctors, and actually we see her on screen much more than the doctors. In order to create authenticity and realism, the film is actually shot in the hospital that the book was set in, and stars one of the doctors who worked there. The colours here in the mise-en-scène are very pale and neutral, whilst Ratched, appearing in her darker clothes, again creates a sense of disruption to that peace and tranquility. Some shadows suggesting it's earlier in the morning. They're very calming colours, so we get a sense that this is in order to keep the patients very calm and under control. We've got that red light though, which is very significant because of course red signifies danger, and in this case it comes across as a warning as to what type of person Nurse Ratched actually is. On the making of documentary, Milos Forman talks about the casting of Nurse Ratched and wanting someone who looks pure evil. However, he decided over time that it would be much better if that evil wasn't clearly evident on her face. And so when we first meet Nurse Ratched, she looks smart and professional, but there's no hint of the evil that lies underneath. She is someone who thinks that she is helping other people. Her inability to be flexible and consider different ideas means that she comes across as very strict and unhelpful. Of course, later in the film, when she's back in this location, but this time surrounded by the patients, and in particular having a conversation with Billy, she is particularly malicious and uses information that she knows about him to really put him back in his place. So we see that really evil, nasty side of her later in the film, and we understand what motivates McMurphy to attack her. We can't see it here, but the genius of Louise Fletcher's performance is often in her facial expression and body language. Her facial expression is very cold, very difficult to read, but with a suggestion of underlining tension and possibly hatred for the people that she works with. So for my third shot, I've chosen this group shot of one of the therapy sessions, and this comes probably from around halfway through the film. This is where McMurphy has realised that in order to leave the institution, Nurse Ratched has got to kind of sign him off and say that he's fit to leave. Up until this point, he just thought he was biding his time, and we can tell from his body language and posture that he's really not very happy at this point. Now, the reason that I've chosen this shot is because in most of the therapy sessions, we are often placed in amongst the patients, making us almost like one of them. The camera usually tends to focus on individual people within the cast so that we see their reactions to things, and that's what makes this film so convincing. It is those reactions and those performances from the different actors. So here with this group shot, we are looking at the group from the point of view of the nurses, so we are seeing really through Nurse Ratched's eyes, and this gives us a sense of them and us. It's creating that binary opposition between the patients and the nurses obviously holding much more of the authority. Perhaps this symbolises McMurphy's descent as he realises that he hasn't really got the smallest amount of power that he thought he might have had. He also feels slightly disconnected from the group because he feels that they've betrayed him by not telling him that Ratched is the one who decides whether he leaves. The different postures, the different body language of the patients goes to show their different personalities and the different conditions that they have. Here we can see Jack Nicholson, McMurphy, wearing the white patient's outfit, so he's starting to become less different to everyone else. He's starting to look a lot more like them. He really is one of the patients rather than just an outsider kind of dropping by and causing a bit of a problem. He perhaps has become more weighted down with that knowledge that he cannot just leave when he wants to. And he's also really shocked as he asks the group that many of the other patients are voluntary, and apparently the production team found when they did their research that actually a lot of the people in institutions were there voluntarily. Perhaps the character that the audience is most shocked at and McMurphy is most shocked is Billy, who is so young to be in an institution and appears to have no real medical condition apart from his stutter. And that's one of the things that the film does so well. We spend time thinking about whether McMurphy really should be in the institution, whether there really is anything wrong with him. And we think about that in connection to the other patients too. As the film goes on, we realise that a lot of these people have no mental illness, and the treatment that they're receiving in hospital is the thing that is making life so unpleasant for them. Jack Nicholson's posture here looks almost childlike, as if he's been told off by a parent or teacher. And of course, one of the ways the nurses treat the patients is very childish. They infantilise them by taking away many of their rights. The fact that he's in the centre of the frame obviously tells us that he's the key character, but this is an ensemble cast, and all of these actors contribute to the film in significant ways, sometimes making it feel chaotic, sometimes making it feel much calmer with an underlying tension, which is what we've got here. Remember, they favoured method acting, so they had spent several weeks rehearsing these characters. They had shadowed and observed real patients in the hospital, and they'd spent several nights there, so they'd really got a sense of who their characters were. Having said that, if we think about the positioning in the frame, it feels very crowded. All the spaces are taken up with actors, whether in the foreground or the background. So it's quite oppressive at this moment, which of course is a good word to use to describe the whole environment of the hospital. But at the same time, each actor with their position, their body language gives us something different to look at, which makes it interesting when we're looking at this in a long take. So for my fourth frame, I've chosen this one of McMurphy about to get his electric shock therapy. And this is shot in a series of long takes. We've got some cuts to his boots and things like that, but largely the camera lingers in quite an uncomfortable way. It's not just the editing speed though that makes it uncomfortable, obviously. It's the shot sizes, it's the framing, it's the amount of characters in the frame. At different times the room feels really overwhelming, and it's clear that McMurphy has got no chance of getting out of this hideous experience that we're about to see. The sound in this scene, which is all diegetic sound, also helps to create that sense of realism and therefore making it more shocking and uncomfortable for the audience. We hear some dialogue, mostly McMurphy's questions about what's going on, and those questions, along with his facial expression, convey the fact that he's really very frightened. Despite his bluster and bravado and his playfulness that we often see, there is an underlying fear because he doesn't know what's going on, but he knows it's going to be something awful. The responses to McMurphy's questions from the nurse are very straightforward and clinical, showing that this procedure has happened many times before. And of course we see some of McMurphy's friends being wheeled down the corridor, having had their treatments just before he goes in. Here we've got a medium close-up overhead shot, which allows us to see the basic and old-fashioned equipment that's being used, plus the amount of hands that are holding McMurphy down. However, the shot size does vary, and we end up being in this extreme close-up that shows McMurphy's discomfort. We also, again, in a long take, linger on that for a long time so we can see the impact of the electric shock therapy and just how barbaric it is. Having these close-up shots makes a real impact. This is one of the most powerful scenes in the film, and it needs to be because it's sending a message about the treatment of mental illnesses during this period of time and just how outdated those practices were even then. This is a very serious and distressing moment, which means that when we see McMurphy in the next scene, we're so relieved to see that he's not lost his sense of humour and his cheekiness, which of course actually makes the ending of the film even more impactful. So for my final frame, I've chosen what some people refer to as the escape scene, and they suggest that McMurphy and Chief escape together, and that's exactly what Chief is talking about in the dialogue, sort of freeing McMurphy and letting him escape from the institution. Now we know, because we see in other shots in this sequence, that McMurphy has been given a lobotomy. We don't actually see the lobotomy taking place. As an audience, we're left to imagine it. And in connection to the previous frame, it's easy for us to imagine what that surgery might have been like, that same barbaric procedure that we saw before, and even more extreme. Having had a lobotomy, it might be that McMurphy would be left in this kind of stupor, in this zombie-like state that we see him in here. He might have been left incontinent, having seizures. He would have been restricted intellectually and emotionally. So the person, the fun-loving character, the naughtiness of McMurphy that we've come to like as the film has gone on, is no longer there. And so as an audience, we can see why Chief feels justified in killing McMurphy at this point, to put him out of his misery and to give him his freedom in a different way. That relief that we felt earlier on in the film, after the electric shock therapy, when McMurphy pretends to be this sort of zombie-like character and then starts laughing, we don't have that here. We see that actually McMurphy has been sort of broken by the system. He cannot escape now the institution. He will be there for the rest of his life in this state where he hasn't got full control of his body. So it's a very sad ending for McMurphy, which is why Chief's escape is so important and gives us a sort of renewed hope. The reason why I've chosen this frame is because of the intimacy of the scene. So it's a beautiful two-shot in close-up, and we can really see how Chief is cradling McMurphy almost like a child. And we can see the genuine affection that Chief feels for McMurphy. And I think that's because McMurphy has filled him with courage. He says he feels as strong as a mountain. The dialogue at this point is very quiet in volume. You have to listen quite carefully to hear what Chief says. But as we know, he is a man of very few words. For most of the film, he has been mute. So here, when he's speaking, that adds that extra poignancy and importance to his words. And we're encouraged to really pay attention to what it is he says. We could argue then that part of the message of the film is about male friendships, male relationships, and men empowering men. Here, in an institution which is very much controlled by women, and women are not represented well in this film at all, we've got a male friendship that leads to a positive, hopeful conclusion. It's arguable that Chief would never have had the courage to leave the institution without McMurphy's encouragement. Okay, so that is an awful lot to take in about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, but I hope it's been helpful in your studies, and I hope that you can pick your own 5 frames to further develop your knowledge of this film. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you again next time. Bye!